On June 24, 2025, the guns fell silent over Tehran. The world exhaled. 12 days of war between Israel, the United States, and Iran had ended with American bunker busters tearing into Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, and everyone, from oil traders in Singapore to diplomats in Geneva, believed the crisis was finally over. It was not over. It was only beginning. What followed that ceasefire was not peace. It was a masterclass in strategic patience, a demonstration of how a wounded regime, stripped of its air defenses and its most senior commanders, can still bend the most powerful military alliance on Earth to its own timeline, simply by knowing exactly how long a truce can be stretched before it snaps. Within 8 months, the same battlefield was burning again, this time with the supreme leader of Iran dead, 30,000 of his own citizens killed in the streets, and the global economy staring down the barrel of a blocked Strait of Hormuz. To understand how a ceasefire meant to end a war instead became one of the sharpest weapons in Iran's arsenal, you have to go back much further than June 2025, because this was never really about 12 days. It was about 50 years of a regime learning over and over again that the pause between wars can be more valuable than the war itself. Iran's relationship with time is different from almost any other state actor in modern geopolitics. Since the 1979 revolution, the Islamic Republic has survived an 8-year war with Iraq that killed hundreds of thousands of its own people, survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, survived the American invasions of both its neighbors, survived crushing sanctions regimes, and survived the assassination of its most important military strategist, Qasem Soleimani, in a drone strike ordered by the very same American president who would later negotiate with his successors. Every one of those experiences taught Tehran the same lesson. Direct, prolonged confrontation with a superior military power is suicidal, but diplomacy, especially diplomacy that looks like weakness from the outside, can be turned into a tool of delay, reconstruction, and repositioning. This is not a new insight for Iran, it is doctrine. Persian strategic thinking, going back centuries before the Islamic Republic existed, has always favored indirect resistance over direct confrontation, because Iran has rarely, if ever, possessed the raw military power to win a straight fight against its adversaries. What it has always possessed is depth, patience, and a tolerance for pain that Western planners consistently underestimate. So when the ceasefire was announced on June 24, 2025, brokered hastily by the United States and Qatar, after Iran fired a symbolic barrage of missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, causing no casualties and giving both sides an off-ramp they could each claim as victory, something important was already happening beneath the surface. Iranian state television declared a great victory. President Masoud Pezeshkian gave a televised address praising the resilience of the Iranian people. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, in a rare recorded address days later, insisted the American strikes had accomplished nothing and that Iran would never surrender. On the other side of the ledger, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it a historic victory over Iran's nuclear and missile ambitions. Both narratives could not be true at the same time, and that contradiction is the first clue to what was really going on. When both sides declare victory after the same conflict, it usually means neither side achieved a decisive result, and both are now racing to control the story before the other side controls the outcome. Iran had lost heavily in a military sense. Its air defenses were shattered. Senior commanders were dead. Its nuclear infrastructure had been struck by the most powerful conventional weapons ever used against buried nuclear facilities. But Iran had lost the battle while keeping something the United States did not fully account for, the ability to walk away from the table whenever it judged the moment was right, and to use every single day of ceasefire not as a step toward disarmament, but as a step toward reconstruction. This is where the psychological dimension of the story becomes as important as the military one. A ceasefire creates an illusion of resolution for the public watching from the outside. Headlines move on. Oil markets stabilize. Diplomats congratulate themselves. But for a regime that has spent 5 decades treating negotiation as a form of warfare by other means, A ceasefire is simply a change in tactics, not a change in objective. Iranian officials, almost immediately after the June 2025 truce, began signaling doubts about their commitment to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi hinted that Iran might abandon its international nuclear obligations entirely, a threat Tehran had made before, but one that carried new weight given the destruction its program had just suffered. This is the pattern that would repeat itself again and again over the following year. Every ceasefire, every truce, every so-called breakthrough memorandum became, in practice, a negotiating instrument used not to end the standoff, but to extend it on terms increasingly favorable to Iran. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the body responsible for verifying what remained of Iran's nuclear capability, was unable to resume inspections inside the country for months after the strikes. Its Director General, Rafael Grossi, warned publicly that any agreement without inspection provisions would be, in his words, an illusion of an agreement. That warning proved prophetic, because what followed was exactly that, an illusion, repeated across multiple ceasefires, each one dressed up in the language of diplomatic progress, while the fundamental question, whether Iran still intended to build a nuclear weapon, remained permanently unresolved. By the end of 2025, Iran's economy was in freefall. The currency had collapsed. New international sanctions triggered in September through what is known as the snapback mechanism, a provision of the original 2015 nuclear deal allowing previous sanctions to be automatically reimposed if Iran violated its terms, compounded the damage from the war. This economic collapse detonated into the streets in December 2025 when mass protests broke out across the country, the largest since the 1979 revolution itself. These were not protests about foreign policy. They were protests about bread, about currency, about a government that had spent billions on missiles and militias abroad while its own population could no longer afford basic goods at home. Encouraged, according to multiple reports, by the United States, the protests spread rapidly through January 2026. President Trump publicly threatened American intervention if Iranian security forces killed protesters. It did not stop the regime. On January 8th, Iranian security forces launched a brutal crackdown that, according to figures released by Iran's own Ministry of Health, killed at least 30,000 people. This number is horrifying, and it deserves to be treated with appropriate caution, since it comes from an Iranian government source in the midst of an information war, and independent verification of the full scale of the killings remains difficult. But even taking the most conservative reading of available reporting, this was one of the deadliest state crackdowns on civilian protest anywhere in the world in the 21st century, and it fundamentally changed how Washington and Jerusalem viewed the calculus of striking Iran again. Here is where the strategic logic of the ceasefire as a weapon becomes undeniable. The regime that had just killed tens of thousands of its own citizens to stay in power did not collapse. It did not negotiate away its nuclear ambitions in a moment of weakness. Instead, it used the very appearance of internal crisis to buy something even more valuable: time and sympathy. Reza Pahlavi, the exiled former crown prince and a prominent opposition figure, publicly urged Trump and Netanyahu to strike only military targets and spare the civilian infrastructure that ordinary Iranians would need to rebuild their country after the regime eventually fell. It was a plea rooted in genuine concern for the Iranian people, but it also revealed something crucial about how the world was thinking about Iran at that moment, as a regime on the edge of collapse rather than a regime capable of striking back. That assumption turned out to be a serious miscalculation. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive joint operation against Iran, codenamed Epic Fury by Washington and Roaring Lion by Israel, echoing the Rising Lion operation from the previous June. Nearly 900 strikes hit Iranian targets in the first 12 hours alone. This time, the attacks went further than anyone had gone before. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself was killed, along with Ali Larijani, a key figure who had been involved in nuclear negotiations. For a regime that had built its entire identity around the supreme leader as an unkillable, almost mythic figure of continuity since Khomeini's death in 1989, this was an earthquake. And yet, astonishingly, the Islamic Republic did not fracture. It reorganized, fired back with ballistic missiles that struck Tel Aviv directly for the first time in this new phase of war, and closed the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point through which roughly 20% of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply passes every single day. This is the moment the story stops being simply about missiles and airstrikes and becomes a story about economics, because the closure of Hormuz was where Iran discovered its most effective weapon of the entire conflict, and it had nothing to do with its depleted military. It had to do with global supply chains. When ships stopped moving through the strait, fuel shortages rippled across Asia within weeks. Oil prices spiked. Airline stocks in the United States and Europe swung wildly in response to every rumor of escalation or de-escalation. Suddenly, the calculus in Washington was not simply about defeating Iran militarily, which the United States and Israel had already demonstrated they could do with terrifying precision. It was about how long the global economy could tolerate the consequences of pushing Iran into a corner with no exit. This is the same lesson every cornered actor in history eventually learns, that leverage does not always come from strength. It can come from your enemy's vulnerability. Iran could not match American air power. It could not rebuild its air defenses fast enough to stop precision strikes, but it could hold a fifth of the world's energy supply hostage, and in doing so, it forced the most powerful military alliance in history to negotiate on a timeline dictated not by battlefield victory, but by oil futures in London and Tokyo. What followed between March and June 2026 is a case study in how ceasefires can be weaponized, not through violence, but through the deliberate manipulation of ambiguity. On March 25th, Pakistan, acting as an intermediary, delivered a 15-point American proposal to Iran, calling for a complete end to its nuclear program, restrictions on ballistic missiles, and the reopening of Hormuz in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran rejected it within days, with an anonymous official telling Iranian state media that Iran would end the war when it decided to, and only when its own conditions were met. That single sentence captures the entire strategic posture Iran maintained throughout this period. It was not negotiating to find a mutually acceptable outcome. It was negotiating to control the tempo of the conflict, drawing out each round of talks just long enough to avoid a return to full-scale war, while never actually conceding the core demand the United States kept returning to, an end to uranium enrichment. Iran's counter-proposal demanded war reparations and international recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, demands so far outside what the United States or Israel could accept that they functioned less as a genuine offer and more as a tool to keep talks alive without ever letting them conclude. Then came the ceasefire of April 8, 2026, mediated by Pakistan, which was meant to last 2 weeks and instead became the template for everything that followed. Within hours of its announcement, Israel launched massive airstrikes on Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah, Iran's most important regional proxy. Iranian officials immediately declared that any ceasefire had to include a halt to attacks on Hezbollah as well, effectively tying the fate of the entire Iran negotiation to a completely separate conflict in a different country, a classic linkage strategy that gave Tehran multiple points of leverage instead of one. When Israel refused to include Lebanon, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz again, and the United States responded by imposing a naval blockade on Iranian shipping. For the next several weeks, both sides accused each other of violating a truce that neither side had ever fully defined in writing. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it reveals something profound about how this ceasefire functioned as a weapon rather than a resolution. No formal text laying out mutual, agreed terms was ever released after the April agreement. Each side made its own public statements about what the ceasefire meant, and because there was no shared binding document, Both Iran and the United States could accuse the other of betrayal whenever it served their interests, while each continued pursuing their own objectives underneath the cover of a truce that existed more in rhetoric than in reality. By May, the war of economic attrition intensified. President Trump announced Project Freedom, an American initiative to help commercial ships transit the Strait of Hormuz despite Iranian threats. Iran responded almost immediately with what appeared to be its first attack since the ceasefire began, striking targets in the United Arab Emirates. The blockade and counter-blockade continued through the following weeks, with American and Iranian forces exchanging fire as U.S. naval vessels moved through the strait. Only 15 ships made it through Hormuz by early March, a staggering collapse in traffic through a passage that under normal conditions carries dozens of tankers every single day. Trump himself acknowledged the fragility of the entire arrangement, telling reporters the ceasefire was on what he called life support. And yet it did not fully collapse, because neither side actually wanted the alternative. The United States did not want to be dragged into an endless war that was already destabilizing global energy markets and threatening the broader Trump administration's economic agenda. Iran, for all its defiant rhetoric, could not survive a return to full-scale bombardment of its already devastated military and economic infrastructure. This mutual reluctance to fully break the ceasefire, combined with neither side's willingness to fully honor it either, is precisely what allowed Iran to keep using it as leverage for so long. A ceasefire that nobody trusts but nobody wants to end becomes an incredibly powerful tool for the side with more patience. And Iran, after 50 years of practice, has patience the United States political cycle simply does not. The culmination of this entire strategy arrived on June 17, 2026, when President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum, remotely, with Trump signing during a dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron at the Palace of Versailles following the G7 summit, and Pezeshkian signing separately in Tehran. The symbolism alone tells you everything about how detached this agreement was from the reality on the ground, a peace framework for one of the deadliest Middle Eastern wars in decades, finalized over dinner at a French palace, rather than at a negotiating table with both leaders present. The memorandum established a 60-day ceasefire period intended to produce a final agreement on Iran's nuclear program, the reopening of Hormuz, sanctions relief, and the unfreezing of billions of dollars in Iranian assets. According to details later reported by Al Jazeera, the agreement even included language allowing Iran to maintain what was described as the current status quo of its nuclear program during the negotiation period, with the United States committing not to impose new sanctions or deploy additional forces in the region while talks continued. Read carefully, this language did something remarkable. It did not require Iran to stop enriching uranium. It required Iran only to not build a nuclear weapon and to discuss the disposition of its enriched uranium stockpile at some undetermined point in the future. In other words, after more than a year of war, thousands of strikes, the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, and catastrophic damage to Iran's nuclear infrastructure, the final negotiated framework still left Iran's most contested capability formally unresolved, protected under the umbrella of an ongoing diplomatic process that had already proven, time and again, capable of stretching indefinitely. This is not a coincidence, and it is not simply a failure of American diplomacy either. It is the direct, calculated result of Iran's consistent strategy across every single ceasefire in this 18-month saga. Treat each pause in fighting not as a step toward disarmament, but as a mechanism for extracting economic relief, buying reconstruction time, and preserving ambiguity around the nuclear question for as long as possible. Every deadline Trump set, the 21st of March, then the 23rd, then the 7th of April, then subsequent extensions through the spring, came and went without Iran fully capitulating on enrichment, and yet the war never fully resumed at the scale of February 2026 either. Iran found the precise equilibrium point between provocation and restraint, striking just enough to demonstrate it could not be pushed into total surrender, while never striking so hard that it triggered the kind of overwhelming response that had killed its own supreme leader. That is an extraordinarily difficult balance to maintain, and the fact that Iran managed to sustain it across more than a year of shifting battlefield conditions, economic collapse, and mass civilian death at the hands of its own government says something important about the institutional resilience of the Islamic Republic, regardless of what anyone thinks of its legitimacy or its conduct. There is also a deeper lesson here about the limits of military dominance in the modern world. The United States and Israel possess overwhelming conventional and technological superiority over Iran. That was proven beyond doubt across multiple rounds of strikes that destroyed nuclear facilities, killed senior commanders, and even eliminated the supreme leader himself, an outcome that would have been considered almost unthinkable a decade earlier. And yet none of that firepower translated into a clean, final resolution. Why? Because modern warfare against a state actor embedded in complex global energy markets is not decided purely by military force. It is decided by what each side can tolerate economically and politically over time. Iran could tolerate enormous pain, including the deaths of tens of thousands of its own citizens, because the regime's survival instinct has always prioritized staying in power over protecting its population, a grim but historically consistent pattern for authoritarian systems facing existential threats. The United States, by contrast, operates within a political system where sustained high oil prices, disrupted global trade, and the risk of a wider regional war carry real electoral and economic consequences that no administration can indefinitely ignore. Iran understood this asymmetry better than almost anyone gave it credit for, and it exploited the ceasefire process specifically because a ceasefire, unlike a battlefield, is a space where economic and political pressure matters more than missiles. None of this means Iran won some kind of clear victory. Its economy remains in ruins. Its currency has collapsed. Its air defenses were dismantled. Its supreme leader is dead, an event with consequences for the internal power structure of the regime that are still unfolding and genuinely uncertain, since succession within Iran's clerical system has never been tested under conditions this chaotic. What Iran achieved instead was survival with leverage, the ability to walk away from the table at will, to link unrelated conflicts together for negotiating advantage, to hold global energy markets hostage through a single geographic choke point, and to stretch every diplomatic process long enough that the underlying nuclear question was never definitively closed. This is a different kind of victory than the ones fought and won on battlefields, but in the long arc of geopolitical history, it may prove to be the more durable one. Wars fought with missiles end when one side runs out of the ability to fight. Wars fought with ceasefires end when one side runs out of the patience to keep negotiating. And patience, as Iran has proven again and again since 1979, is the one resource its adversaries have consistently underestimated. What happens next remains genuinely uncertain, and honest analysis has to acknowledge the limits of prediction here. The 60-day window established by the Islamabad Memorandum was always going to be the real test, not of Iran's willingness to disarm, but of whether the United States would accept another extension, another ambiguous framework, another round of talks that preserved the status quo rather than resolving it. Based on the pattern established over the previous 18 months, that outcome is at least plausible, though far from certain, particularly given hawkish voices within both the American and Israeli governments who remain convinced, not without reason, that Iran will never willingly abandon its nuclear ambitions and that only sustained military and economic pressure can force that outcome. What is clear, regardless of how the immediate negotiations resolve, is that Iran has demonstrated something the rest of the world will not easily forget: that a ceasefire is not always the end of a conflict. Sometimes, in the hands of a regime willing to sacrifice its own people and stretch every deadline to its breaking point, a ceasefire is simply the conflict continuing by other means, quieter, slower, and in some ways, far more dangerous, because it convinces the world the danger has already passed.